So these are wonderful papers. They raise lots of fascinating questions. And as I said earlier, I've invited everybody to read each other's papers so that, oh, thank you. Is that a little better? Okay. I've invited our speakers to read each other's papers and to ask questions of each other so that we can have a collegial discussion about the nature of education, and we want to share it with you. I'll begin with just one question, which I think is relevant to all of you. I mentioned you're on different paths in this exploration adventure. Each paper has developed an exemplar based on your understanding of Whitehead's process philosophy. My question is this: when did you come across Whitehead, and how critical is your understanding of Whitehead's process philosophy to your understanding now? Is it absolutely necessary? Is it the groundwork? Or is it more like a very helpful additional understanding? And that depends, it's partly on your own background and your history, but it's also on how you relate to Whitehead and to other thinkers too. So I'll throw that one out and then let you play.
Go ahead. It's a very interesting question. I think I'm gonna start at the end. Alex and I had a nice talk when we walked back from lunch today, talking about the language that Whitehead used, and I think it is kind of the problem that Whitehead was facing and that we're still facing now, that our language and our culture is not really suited to express what process philosophy is trying to tell. So it's basically teach me Chinese without using Chinese, you know, just teach me Chinese with English words and English letters, and then it's let's see if we get there.
No numbers.
Yeah, so I think for me, process philosophy is, especially reading Process and Reality, was, I carried around like a Bible for several years, and I was always like, you know, poking in the fog. And sometimes the fog opens up and a ray of light comes in and I'm like, that's what he means. And I think it's still like that there are little pokes and little invitations to think of things differently. And I think we all need to put a lot of effort into the way we shape our thinking and our language and our action so that process cannot just be a concept, but actually something real. And for me to say, which has, like, I think there has been like a second pillar next to process philosophy rising up in the last years, especially working for the Art and Nature Foundation, and that is ecology, and that is system structures of ecosystems, like how do they work, how do they interact, and I think if it would have been really interesting if Whitehead was not just a mathematician and logician, but maybe also either related to or also studied in biology. But I think right now we know much more about ecosystem structures. And so for me, this is really like a very productive exchange. Yeah, that's, yeah.
Well, thank heavens Whitehead was a polymath.
Yeah, so Whitehead has, so I just finished a dissertation on Whitehead. So I've probably spent more time with Whitehead over the last couple of years than anyone else in my life. Very important for me. I mean, I still think that there's a lot of value in the aims of education, and you know, some of the things that he brings forth there. But I'm also Whitehead himself is not the remainder of things. He's an entree onto the remainder of things, So he wasn't the first one to use the word organism to describe a child, in the education system, but he was where I encountered that in conversation. So I think that. For that it's been very very helpful for me to think with, and then also beside and maybe beyond Whitehead, whose voice is continually relevant, but not the only voice.
I encountered Whitehead through process theology in seminary, and I think it was kind of like language for maybe a feeling that I had that I walked around with that I just didn't have language for until I met Whitehead. And then all of a sudden there was, all of this language that seemed to nicely associate with understanding that I felt like I just sort of intuitively understood. So then it was just like, okay, now where can we go with this, And I think Whitehead himself always said it's what he's speculating is not the end all be all, but it must always be in process, and that's what's exciting about conferences like this, is to be in conversation and in process together.
May I add a point? You just. No, I want to add to what I said previously and what you just said. There's this quote by Whitehead in Process and Reality when he talks about philosophy being the mediator between religion and science. It's on the very first pages. And then he says there's a difference in tempo between the conceptual aspect of our organism and the experiential aspect and of feeling. And this difference in tempo, I mean, we can think really fast, but we can only, learn and act really slow. To bring this together into a coherent structure are these moments that you feel like you actually understand what's going on in this world. And I think that process philosophy, especially Whitehead's writings were, for me, the first time that I realized that I had the feeling that philosophers are not just trying to come up with a fancy concept that is logical, but that is also adequate and applicable and coherent. And so, yeah. Interconnected. And interconnected, yeah. Oh, we should ask each other questions now.
Should we ask a question and then we open it up if other people have questions? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have a question for you, Thomas. I really appreciated your, the way you articulated higher education, its current state, the hopes that you have, the laments and the sadness that you also carry. You mentioned about, that if we could find a way to be back in touch with our affections, I think you used David Orr as kind of a way into that. And I wonder if you have thoughts, like how could higher education help to cultivate more love, more affection in the world? What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, I haven't solved this question, but it is one that keeps me up at night. Yeah, I mean, I think context is so interesting and so helpful here too, because I teach in a school of theology, so it's kind of understood that we'll approach it with a particular value-laden system and tradition. One of John Cobb's criticisms is that we have a lot of research universities that are pretending that they're value neutral, that values aren't in play. And what they mean by that is that we're not going to talk about the values that are in play or critically interrogate those. So this is where I think. This is where I think the ancient traditions of paideia and the spiritual, traditions and wisdom traditions and all of that, or in some ways much more balanced and attuned to and attuned to the value-laden nature of life. And so, I mean, thankfully, as a pastor, I have the opportunity to kind of, move between those two worlds. It's kind of built in for me. As someone who's in the humanities side of things, I lament the degree to which that is being hollowed out, but I also understand some of the criticisms and problems there too. So I think that's why we need all the help we can get.
I have a brief question for Bonnie. You mentioned that the teacher is always also a student. Could you elaborate on that? In which sense? Because I assume it's a different sense than the student is a student.
I think the teacher's also a student, and students are also teachers. I should have, I think there are so many puzzles and problems in the world right now that it takes all of our best thinking and our best creativity to work those out. And I mean, even in kindergarten, in my interaction with my students, there's a sense of almost collegiality in the kind of problem solving that we're doing together. And in some ways, in a more intense way than I remember from when I was teaching before. But that could be because I'm a different person in the classroom now than I was when I was, 22, 23 years old. So yes, I think there's, and I think that there's a spirit of humility within education that keeps us learning together. As soon as I have a mentor who says, as soon as when the answer appears, the thinking stops. And I imagine that's closely related to your coyote teaching.
Exactly.
And so we keep asking questions of one another, and in the midst of all of those questions, what we discover together, regardless of where we are in our life, the developmental, in our lifespan, regardless of where we are in that, we discover that there are always more questions than there are answers, and we do that together.
Beautiful conversation. Thank you. We have some time for questions. Teachers out there, professors out there, I see you first.
I'm not a teacher, I'm a student. Hi everyone, my name is Raymond. I'm a student at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I guess my question is for all three of the panel members. Basically, I was considering what was being shared, and it was mentioned, the value-laden nature of education, the need for a particular kind of pedagogy, and I'm wondering that to what degree this idea of the speedometer, or of taking a more median approach to discourse and to education kind of runs up against some sort of limit. Because if we're aiming for build up and edification, then I feel like that model could run into the fallacy of the golden mean, where, for instance, if we're talking about whether or not the sky is blue, if someone else says that it's yellow, the answer is not that the sky is green. And especially how relevant that limit is when we're approaching ecological catastrophe. So, for instance, the middle ground between climate denial and climate and the affirmation of the climate crisis is not that it's sort of happening. So I just wonder, at what point does the negotiation between polarities run up against some sort of limit, and how do you approach that as educators?
I would say, I'm just going to go ahead. I think we need to be careful not to think in compromises here. I'm not suggesting that we're trying to make everyone happy. With the speedometer model, the idea is to have all the options and then pick one, or come up with a new one. And I think that's very important, that a lot of times we're stuck with where we come from. And we put down the other side as not important because we're stuck on our side. And so this is why this speedometer model is just a training to have the entire set of cards and then pick one. And in my experience, like especially when working with teachers, and they when I'm the trainer, the one giving the seminar, they ask me, what should I do? And I'm in no position to answer this question because I don't know the students, I don't know the situation. And then I usually just open up this set of cards and say, look, if your students are more, let's the adventurous type, then you go in this direction. But if your students are more the analytical type, or if they need more safety, or if they need more backup or knowledge, and also are there exams coming up and so on. So you open this thing and then you tell them, so think of your class, what's the right choice? And they go like this, they immediately know the answer. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to have more flexibility in our minds in order to face rapid changes. And we're going to face a lot of rapid change. And that means we need to train this flexibility beforehand to adapt quickly.
Thanks for these lively presentations. One small note on Aristotle. Dikaia protantes, dikaia ginometa. He has, if you want to become just, you have to practice it. So, or playing kitara. So he has a different form of education, but he was aware of it. It's not just coming up of everything. And I would like to stress what you said as well, the art of progress. And I think what Bonnie demonstrated, it's an artistic effort to have this kind of intercommunication, the way you were describing it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, this question's for Thomas. I'm not sure it's a fair question. I once had an executive in the church I serve write to me and say, Al, when are you going to own up to the fact that your process theology is hurting God's church? Some of us at lunch today were talking about how much of our church affiliations is sort of antithetical to a process understanding and a process way of approaching learning and even participation. I can imagine that perhaps in your church affiliation, you've run up against some of that. So I just wonder what thoughts you might have in terms of helping our churches to learn and develop more process-oriented approaches.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have found that, and I think that my co-panelists have already hinted at this, that there is something intuitive about a process relational approach to life. I mean, even in my Baptist tradition, which is, pretty conservative on the whole, especially in the South, there's an idea that we pray to a God that hears us, and if our classical theological conceptions would make trouble for that, there's a sense that the piety, I think, of people are closer maybe than what they would be able to explain conceptually. I have found that I try to do as much process-friendly interpretation of Scripture as I can do without necessarily drawing attention to it. Which is to say, let us see some of the dynamics that are there, the relationality that's there, the openness that's there. Can we live into that? And I've also found that in a cultural context like mine that is much more homogenous, proximity is such a huge thing for opening hearts and minds, and so you can talk about other people and try to create hospitality there or whatever, but until they until they show up on your door, that's kind of a difficult sell sometimes. So again, I mean, I think just kind of cultivating opportunities for new relationships can do a lot of that work for us.
Timothy Murphy, this question is for Bonnie. How do you negotiate in practice the tension between, as you said, considering the who of learning before the what, and the externally imposed standards of educational systems that say these shall be the benchmarks of what you will teach? How do you kind of negotiate those two, that insight and that external standard?
Yeah, great question. And it's challenging. Negotiating that tension is really challenging. I feel like I live in the tension most of the time, which was why I'm so grateful for this speedometer model, because now I have a model that I can work my tension out on this model and see if my thinking might be a little more flexible than it feels a lot of the time. You know, in kindergarten, I'm privileged in that I get to receive children and parents at the very beginning of their journey in this in the public school system. And even though, yes, there are a lot of externally imposed standards, if there's any place where there's wiggle room, it's probably going to be in kindergarten. And there are some things that I tend to be pretty dogmatic about and rigid about, trying to keep the child in the center of the table instead of, you know, the list of benchmarks and the list of standards in the center of the table. For example, like, I think kids should be able to make their own choices about what's luring them in, what is it about the world that is capturing their imagination and their attention that they want to learn about. They should be able to choose that for themselves rather than have me tell them this is what they should be focusing on. So I can find little ways throughout the day to make sure that I have room for them to be who they are. But the tension is real, and I'm representative of just about every teacher in the system. It's not like it's just an tension that's in my body. All of us are working on that together. So policymakers, educational policymakers, if they're out there listening, talk to teachers about what you should be doing.
First of all, thanks to all three of you for excellent and evocative papers. This has been a great session. My question is to Sinan, and it goes back to the first question that was asked. In your passion to disrupt bifurcated minds, your movement toward dualities makes me wonder, why dualities? And I'm wondering if you've considered the possibility of reframing dualities into social dynamic nexus of values, so that the duality between brashness and its opposite, for example, with courage as a golden mean, might actually be a nexus of values that would include imagination and discernment and experimentation and others, so that you're addressing the bifurcation of mind by disrupting the very dualities that often dominate our society and educational systems, but are part of the bifurcating.
Do you remember our session in the 2015 conference here in Do you remember our session in the 2015 conference here in Claremont? You were. I'm sorry. I'm too silent. I was just saying that, so I want to stress the point that this is just a model. Like it is really just a model, and it's not the only one. That's why I said it's one of the tools. And when I was here in 2015, I talked about philosophizing with children and adults, and I used a different model, which was like a wave. And the wave can change in altitude and it can change in density, and that's actually a 3-point model. And I think polarities can be imagined in different ways. I find this speedometer model to be something very, it's a very handheld device in that sense. You can just very quickly draw it up. And my experience is this, that we usually start with a reductionist thing in our mind. And then you can very quickly see that when you put it on the speedometer, you find that there's a gap and there's a gap and there's a gap. I'm going to give one example. If you talk about certainty and uncertainty, you're going to realize very quickly when you put it on the speedometer that certainty is here and uncertainty is here. So there's a difference in value because uncertainty is usually experienced as something negative. So what is up here? There's openness. And what is down here? There's stifleness. So you realize, okay, certainty and uncertainty is not a very balanced pair. The balanced pair would be certainty and openness. And I have a different version of this model that I use a lot with teachers when it comes to the way the teacher is also the student, which is on one side having an opinion as a teacher, but on the other side being able to actively refrain from having an opinion and actually being open to what the child has to say. And I think both of these sides contribute to something that makes the teacher accessible as a person. And so I'm saying this: the speedometer model is like a slight corrective tweak to the things that we carry around in your mind, in our daily minds. So I'm not trying to say that the speedometer model again is mapping reality. Well, actually it does, but the map of a landscape is not the landscape. And the map doesn't tell you where to go. The map just says this is where this is, and this is where A is, this is where B is, and you still need to decide which route you're going to take. So I want to stress this point that a model is a model, and the real world is the real world. So.
Beautiful. Early on in Aims of Ideas, there's a great line where Whitehead references education. Good education as being a guard against mental dry rot.
Yes.
And I think this panel's given us a shield. So thank you. Please give them a hand.